The beloved teacher everyone respected was fired for abuse, and the parents destroyed her until the videos surfaced. Mrs. Eleanor Vance was escorted out of Meadowbrook Elementary School by security guards on a Thursday morning in late September, and I watched from the parking lot as she carried a cardboard box containing 18 years of teaching materials. Her face was pale and expressionless, shock having apparently shut down every emotion except the mechanical need to keep moving forward. I'd dropped my son Connor off 30 minutes earlier for what I thought would be a normal school day, but the emergency robocall had summoned all parents to an assembly at 9 a.m. for an urgent announcement. Principal Gregory Ashton stood at the auditorium podium with the grave expression of someone delivering news about a national tragedy. He informed us that Mrs. Vance had been immediately terminated following multiple credible reports of physical and emotional abuse of students in her fifth-grade classroom. He said the accusations had come from several families, that the school board had met in emergency session overnight, and that given the severity and consistency of the allegations, they'd decided to remove Mrs. Vance immediately to protect our children. The auditorium erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Mrs. Vance had been teaching at Meadowbrook for nearly 2 decades, had won Teacher of the Year awards, had students who came back years later to thank her for changing their lives. The idea that she'd been abusing children seemed impossible, yet Principal Ashton was standing there telling us it was true. Connor was in Mrs. Vance's class this year, his first year in 5th grade, and he'd been excited about it all summer because his older cousin had loved her teaching style. In the 3 weeks since school started, Connor had come home energized every day, talking about the creative writing projects and the science experiments and how Mrs. Vance made learning feel important. I'd met her twice during parent orientation and back-to-school night, and she'd struck me as passionate, demanding in the way good teachers are, but genuinely invested in her students' growth. Now Principal Ashton was describing a pattern of behavior that included grabbing students roughly, yelling at them in ways that caused psychological distress, and isolating children as punishment in a supply closet. The accusations were specific and disturbing. Parents around me were crying and demanding details. Several mothers I knew from the PTA were already pulling out phones to text other parents who hadn't made it to the assembly. Within minutes, the narrative was spreading through our community at digital speed. Mrs. Vance was a child abuser who'd been hiding behind her reputation for years. She'd terrorized vulnerable children. She needed to be held accountable, not just professionally, but criminally. After the assembly, I picked Connor up from his temporary classroom where students had been relocated with a substitute teacher. I asked him directly if Mrs. Vance had ever hurt him or scared him, and he looked confused by the question. He said no, that Mrs. Vance was strict about behavior and homework, but she'd never been mean to him. I pressed harder, asking if he'd seen her hurt or yell at other students, and Connor hesitated before saying there were times she'd been really firm with kids who were disruptive, but nothing that seemed abusive. His hesitation bothered me. Kids often minimized bad things that happened to them, especially if they didn't want to get adults in trouble or admit they'd been victimized. I told Connor that if Mrs. Vance or anyone had hurt him, he could tell me and I'd protect him. He insisted she hadn't, but I wasn't sure I believed him completely. That evening, I attended an emergency PTA meeting that had been organized by parents demanding more information. Principal Ashton attended along with the school district's legal counsel. 3 families had come forward with complaints against Mrs. Vance, they explained. The complaints described similar patterns of abuse spanning several months. One mother, Diane Coulter, spoke tearfully about how her daughter Emma had come home with bruises on her arms that she initially claimed were from playground accidents, but had finally admitted were from Mrs. Vance grabbing her roughly during class. Another father, Robert Finch, described his son Mason becoming anxious and withdrawn, refusing to go to school, having nightmares about being locked in a dark room. Mason had eventually disclosed that Mrs. Vance had put him in a supply closet for 30 minutes as punishment for talking during silent reading time. A third parent, Angela Torres, said her son Liam had been verbally berated in front of the entire class for forgetting his homework, that Mrs. Vance had called him stupid and lazy, and that the humiliation had crushed his confidence. These accounts were detailed and consistent. The children had described similar behaviors. The parents had documented their complaints in writing and submitted them to Principal Ashton, who'd escalated immediately to the superintendent and school board. The district's lawyer explained that given the seriousness of the allegations and the need to protect students, termination was the appropriate immediate response. Mrs. Vance would have the opportunity to appeal through the teachers' union grievance process. But in the meantime, she was barred from school property and contact with students. The lawyer also mentioned that Child Protective Services had been notified and would be investigating, and that the district was cooperating fully with any criminal investigation the police might open. The parent community's response was swift and vicious. Someone created a Facebook group called Justice for Meadowbrook Students that grew to 300 members within 24 hours. Parents shared stories about Mrs. Vance that they'd previously dismissed as strict teaching, but now reinterpreted as abusive behavior. Someone posted Mrs. Vance's home address along with photos of her house, encouraging people to let her know how we feel about child abusers. Within days, her house had been egged and spray-painted with words I won't repeat. Her car windows were smashed. She received hundreds of threatening messages and phone calls. The local news picked up the story, running segments about abuse in schools and interviewing parents who demanded criminal charges. Mrs. Vance's face was shown repeatedly on television, her name becoming synonymous with teacher misconduct. The teachers' union issued a statement supporting due process and noting that allegations weren't proof of guilt, but that statement was drowned out by parent outrage. How dare the union defend someone who'd hurt children? The political pressure on the district attorney's office was intense, and within a week, criminal charges were filed against Eleanor Vance. 3 counts of child abuse and 1 count of false imprisonment related to the supply closet incident. I participated in the outrage. I shared posts about protecting children and holding abusive teachers accountable. I signed a petition demanding that Mrs. Vance lose her teaching license permanently. I attended a protest outside the school board meeting where parents demanded answers about how this had been allowed to happen. I did all of this because I believed I was protecting my son and other children from someone who'd abused her position of trust. But Connor kept insisting that Mrs. Vance had never hurt him, and his confusion about why everyone was so angry at her bothered me more as days passed. I asked other parents whose kids were in the class what their children had said, and got mixed responses. Some kids confirmed they'd seen Mrs. Vance be really strict or raise her voice. Others said they hadn't noticed anything wrong. A few mentioned that the kids making accusations had been having problems in class before the complaints, behavioral issues that had gotten them in trouble repeatedly. I started wondering if there was more to the story than what we'd been told. I contacted Diane Coulter privately and asked if I could see the bruises she'd mentioned on her daughter's arms. She sent me photos that showed faint marks that could have been from rough handling or could have been from playground activities or any number of causes. The photos weren't as clearly damning as I'd expected from her tearful description. I tracked down Robert Finch and asked more details about the supply closet incident. He said Mason had told him about it 3 weeks after it allegedly happened, that Mason had been vague about the timing and details, but was certain it had occurred. I asked if Robert had reported it to the school immediately when Mason disclosed it, and Robert admitted he'd waited another week before filing the complaint because he wanted to make sure Mason was telling the truth. That delay struck me as odd. If my child told me a teacher had locked them in a closet, I'd have been at the school within hours demanding answers. Robert's hesitation suggested doubt about his son's story, though he insisted now that Mason had been truthful. I spoke with Angela Torres about the verbal berating incident, and she described it in detail, saying Liam had been traumatized by being called stupid in front of his classmates. But when I asked when this had happened, she said it was during the 2nd week of school, which meant it had occurred more than a month before she'd filed her complaint. Why wait so long to report something so damaging? Angela said she'd wanted to give Mrs. Vance a chance to improve before escalating, but that excuse felt thin. The more I talked to the accusing parents, the more inconsistencies I noticed in their accounts and timelines. Connor came home from school in mid-October with news that the substitute teacher had announced they'd be getting a permanent replacement for Mrs. Vance. The new teacher would be starting Monday, and students should be prepared to adjust to different classroom rules and expectations. Connor seemed sad about this, and when I asked why, he said he missed Mrs. Vance and thought it was unfair that she'd been fired. I asked what he meant by unfair, and he explained that some of the kids in class had been saying Mrs. Vance didn't really do the things people were accusing her of, that the stories didn't make sense. Connor mentioned that Emma Coulter had bragged to friends about how her mom was going to get a lot of money from suing the school, that this was going to pay for their family vacation to Disney World. I felt my stomach drop. I asked Connor to repeat exactly what he'd heard Emma say, and he described her telling classmates that her bruises were actually from her brother pushing her during an argument, but her mom had told her to say they were from Mrs. Vance. Connor hadn't thought much about it at the time, assumed Emma was joking or confused, but now it bothered him because Mrs. Vance was in serious trouble. I spent that evening unable to focus on anything else. If Emma had lied about the bruises, had the other accusations also been fabricated? I thought about Mason Finch's vague timeline and his father's delayed reporting. Thought about Liam Torres being called stupid during the second week of school, but his mother waiting a month to complain. The pattern suggested coordination rather than independent disclosures. I decided to do something I knew was controversial, but felt necessary. I reached out to Mrs. Vance directly, sending a message through her lawyer whose contact information was in the news articles. I identified myself as a parent in her former class and said I had questions about the allegations. Her lawyer called me back within an hour and said Mrs. Vance would meet with me if I was willing to hear her side of the story. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, where she was less likely to be recognized. Mrs. Vance looked like she'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. Her hair was grayer, her face lined with stress, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee cup. She thanked me for being willing to listen and said she'd been living in a nightmare of false accusations that she couldn't defend against because proving a negative was nearly impossible. Mrs. Vance explained that she'd never grabbed Emma Coulter roughly, never locked Mason Finch in a supply closet, never called Liam Torres stupid. She said Emma had been having behavioral problems in class, constantly disrupting lessons and refusing to follow instructions. After multiple warnings, Mrs. Vance had contacted Diane Coulter to discuss Emma's behavior and recommend evaluation for ADHD. Diane had reacted defensively, insisting nothing was wrong with Emma and that Mrs. Vance was singling her out unfairly. 2 weeks later, the abuse complaint had been filed. Mason Finch had been caught cheating on a test, and Mrs. Vance had given him a 0 and contacted his parents about academic integrity concerns. Robert Finch had argued that his son wouldn't cheat unless he was being inadequately taught, and had threatened to complain to the principal about her teaching methods. A week later, the supply closet allegation emerged. Liam Torres had been failing to turn in homework repeatedly, and Mrs. Vance had implemented a system where students who didn't complete assignments would work through recess to finish them. Angela Torres had complained that this was punitive and unfair. Shortly after, the verbal abuse complaint was filed. Mrs. Vance believed the accusations were retaliation for her attempting to enforce academic and behavioral standards that these parents found inconvenient. I asked why she hadn't presented this context to the school board, and Mrs. Vance said she'd tried. She'd provided documentation of her communications with all 3 families, showing the pattern of her addressing legitimate student issues followed by abuse complaints. But Principal Ashton had told the board that presenting this information would constitute victim blaming and was inappropriate. The board had accepted the parents' accounts without seriously investigating Mrs. Vance's defense. She'd been terminated within 48 hours of the complaints being filed, faster than the teachers' union could mobilize a proper response. Now, she was facing criminal charges based on accusations she couldn't disprove because the incidents allegedly occurred in her classroom when only she and students were present. Without witnesses or physical evidence beyond the parents' claims, it became her word against 3 families. And in the current climate around protecting children, her word carried no weight. Mrs. Vance said she'd lost everything: her career, her reputation, her savings paying legal fees, her mental health deteriorating under the constant harassment and threats. She'd dedicated 2 decades to teaching children and was being destroyed by lies she couldn't effectively combat. She asked me why I'd reached out, what made me question the narrative everyone else had accepted. I told her about Connor's comments regarding Emma's bragging and the inconsistencies I'd noticed in the accuser's stories. Mrs. Vance's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Odom, had been sitting quietly during our conversation, but now leaned forward. She said they'd suspected the accusations were coordinated and false from the beginning, but had been unable to prove it. The school district had refused to provide security camera footage from the hallways and common areas, claiming privacy concerns. Patricia had filed a discovery motion to obtain the footage as part of the criminal defense, but the district was fighting the request. She asked if I'd be willing to make a statement about what Connor had told me regarding Emma's bragging. I hesitated, because I knew that coming forward would make me a target for the same parent mob that had destroyed Mrs. Vance. But I also knew that if she was innocent, staying silent made me complicit in injustice. I agreed to provide a statement and said I'd ask Connor for more details about what he'd heard. Patricia warned me that the other parents would attack me viciously once they learned I was questioning their accounts, that I should prepare for social consequences. She was right, though I didn't fully understand the extent until I experienced it myself. I spoke with Connor that night and asked him to tell me everything he remembered about Emma's comments, and anything else that seemed important. Connor explained that several students in the class had been confused about the accusations against Mrs. Vance because they didn't match their experiences. Emma had told at least 4 other classmates that her bruises were from her brother, not Mrs. Vance, but that her mom had coached her on what to say. Mason had admitted to friends that he'd made up the supply closet story after his dad told him they needed to get back at Mrs. Vance for the cheating incident. Liam had been overheard saying his mom promised him a new gaming system if he went along with the complaint. Connor said the kids had been talking about this among themselves, but hadn't told adults because they didn't want to get their classmates in trouble or contradict their parents. The children understood on some level that the accusations were lies, but they'd been pressured by parents to maintain the stories. I asked Connor if he'd be willing to tell this to Mrs. Vance's lawyer, and he said yes, that he felt bad for Mrs. Vance and wanted to help her. I called Patricia Odom and arranged for Connor to give a formal statement. She brought a child psychologist to conduct the interview in a way that wouldn't be traumatic, and Connor repeated everything he'd told me, adding more details about other students' comments. Patricia said Connor's testimony was valuable, but wouldn't be enough by itself, because he hadn't witnessed the alleged abuse incidents directly, only heard other students' admissions that they'd lied. She needed to either get the security footage from the school or find other students willing to contradict the accusations. I offered to contact other parents in the class and see if their children had heard similar things. Over the next week, I reached out to 6 families whose kids were in Mrs. Vance's former class. 3 parents told me they believed the abuse accusations and didn't want their children involved in defending an abuser. 1 parent said their child hadn't noticed anything wrong, but they didn't want to get involved because it was too controversial. 2 parents agreed to let me speak with their children, and both kids confirmed what Connor had said. They'd heard Emma, Mason, and Liam admit among themselves that the stories were exaggerated or false, but they'd been afraid to tell adults. Patricia now had 3 student witnesses saying the accusations were fabricated, but she still needed the security footage to definitively prove Mrs. Vance's innocence. The school district continued refusing to release the footage, citing student privacy laws. Patricia filed an emergency motion with the criminal court judge, arguing that the footage was critical evidence that could exonerate her client and that withholding it violated Mrs. Vance's constitutional right to a fair defense. The judge scheduled a hearing on the motion, and I attended as a supporting witness. The district's lawyer argued that releasing footage of minors without parental consent would violate privacy laws and set a dangerous precedent. Patricia countered that the footage showed common areas and hallways, not bathrooms or locker rooms, and that Mrs. Vance's fundamental rights outweighed privacy concerns in this context. She presented the statements from Connor and the other 2 students, arguing that there was reasonable cause to believe the footage would show the allegations were false. The judge reviewed the materials and ruled that the district must produce any security camera footage from the relevant dates and locations described in the allegations, with faces of students other than the accusers digitally blurred to protect privacy. The district had 1 week to comply. I left the courthouse feeling hopeful for the first time, but also anxious because I knew the parent mob would turn on me once word spread that I'd supported Mrs. Vance's defense. I didn't have to wait long for the backlash. That evening, Diane Coulter called me and screamed that I was betraying abuse victims and my son's testimony had been coerced by a predator's lawyer. She said she'd make sure everyone knew I was defending a child abuser. Within 24 hours, I'd been removed from the PTA group chat, and the Justice for Meadowbrook Students Facebook group had a post calling me out by name as someone who was helping Mrs. Vance attack her victims. Parents I'd considered friends stopped responding to my messages. My wife, Rachel, faced harassment at her workplace from co-workers who'd heard about my involvement. Connor was bullied at school by other students whose parents had told them Connor's dad was helping the bad teacher. Our house was egged one night, and someone left a bag of dog feces on our porch with a note calling me a predator enabler. Rachel and I argued about whether I should have gotten involved, whether defending Mrs. Vance was worth destroying our family's social standing. I understood her frustration, but I couldn't back down now because I was convinced Mrs. Vance was innocent and being destroyed by a coordinated lie. The week passed slowly while we waited for the school district to produce the security footage. Patricia Odom called me on a Friday afternoon, her voice barely containing excitement. She said they'd received the footage, and I needed to see it, immediately. I drove to her office and she played multiple video files on her computer, walking me through what they showed. The footage from September covered hallways and the common area outside Mrs. Vance's classroom. There was no audio, but the visuals were clear enough to establish timelines and witness interactions. The first relevant clip showed Emma Coulter leaving Mrs. Vance's classroom during afternoon break on the date her mother claimed she'd been grabbed roughly. Emma's arms were visible in her short-sleeved shirt and showed no marks or bruises. She walked to the water fountain, talked briefly with friends, then returned to class. Another clip from later that same day showed Emma leaving school at dismissal time, again with visible unmarked arms. The bruises her mother had photographed and claimed were from Mrs. Vance couldn't have come from school that day because Emma's arms were clearly fine when she left. The second set of footage showed the supply closet that Mason Finch claimed he'd been locked in for 30 minutes. The closet was visible in the hallway camera angle, and during the time period Mason's father specified for the incident, the closet door never opened. No student entered or exited. Mason himself was visible in the hallway twice during that 30-minute window, walking to the bathroom and back to class. He'd never been in the closet at all. The incident he'd described hadn't happened. The third set of footage showed the classroom doorway and hallway outside during the time frame when Liam Torres claimed Mrs. Vance had verbally berated him in front of the class. The footage showed normal classroom activity visible through the doorway window. Students were working quietly at their desks. Mrs. Vance was moving around the room helping individual students. There was no indication of any dramatic public berating or emotional incident. Whatever had happened during class that day, it didn't match Liam's description of being humiliated and called stupid in front of everyone. Patricia said the footage definitively disproved all three accusations. Emma's bruises hadn't come from school. Mason had never been locked in a closet. Liam's public humiliation hadn't occurred in the way he'd described. She was filing an emergency motion to dismiss all criminal charges and would be providing the footage to the school board with a demand for Mrs. Vance's reinstatement and a public apology. I watched the footage multiple times, feeling sick about how close we'd all come to destroying an innocent woman's life based on lies. The footage didn't just exonerate Mrs. Vance. It proved the three families had filed false reports, coordinated their stories, and maintained those lies even under investigation. This wasn't a case of misunderstanding or different interpretations of events. This was deliberate fraud. The criminal charges against Mrs. Vance were dismissed within 48 hours once the district attorney reviewed the footage. Patricia held a press conference where she played clips of the security footage and explained how it disproved each allegation. She announced that Mrs. Vance would be filing a defamation lawsuit against the three accusing families and a wrongful termination lawsuit against the school district. The story exploded in local and then regional media. The same news outlets that had covered the abuse allegations now ran segments about false accusations and the rush to judgment. The parent community that had been so united in destroying Mrs. Vance fractured immediately. Some parents apologized and claimed they'd been misled by the accusers. Others doubled down, insisting that even if these specific allegations were false, Mrs. Vance must have done something wrong to provoke such accusations. Diane Coulter, Robert Finch, and Angela Torres initially refused to comment, but within days were facing their own criminal investigation for filing false police reports and child endangerment for coaching their children to lie. The police executed search warrants at all 3 homes and seized computers and phones looking for evidence of coordination. What they found was damning. Email and text message chains showed the 3 families had conspired to destroy Mrs. Vance after she'd held their children accountable for behavioral and academic problems. The messages revealed that Diane Coulter had initiated the conspiracy after Mrs. Vance recommended ADHD evaluation for Emma. Diane had been furious at the suggestion something was wrong with her daughter and had reached out to other parents who'd had conflicts with Mrs. Vance. She'd found Robert Finch angry about the cheating incident, and Angela Torres upset about homework requirements. The 3 parents had met secretly and planned their attack. They'd agreed on similar types of allegations that would be hard to disprove and coached their children on what to say. They'd deliberately waited to file complaints until close to the same time so the pattern would look credible. The messages included discussions about getting media attention, forcing the school to act quickly, and making sure Mrs. Vance would be fired before she could defend herself. Most disturbing were messages where they discussed how much money they might get from lawsuits against the district, treating the destruction of a teacher's career as a potential financial opportunity. Diane had written, "We need to make the allegations serious enough that they can't just reprimand her. If we coordinate this right, they'll have to fire her immediately, and then we can sue for letting an abuser teach our kids. This could be worth 6 figures each." The messages showed calculated malice, not genuine concern about child safety. The criminal charges against the 3 parents were filed within a week. Diane Coulter, Robert Finch, and Angela Torres each faced multiple felony counts: conspiracy, filing false police reports, child endangerment for involving their children in the fraud, and attempting to defraud the school district. The children were placed in temporary custody of other family members while Child Protective Services investigated. The 3 families tried to claim they genuinely believed their complaints were accurate, but the text messages destroyed that defense. Principal Gregory Ashton came under intense scrutiny for his handling of the situation. Questions emerged about why he'd pushed for Mrs. Vance's immediate termination without a proper investigation, why he'd blocked her from presenting her defense to the school board, why he'd refused to release security footage that would have quickly resolved the truth. Parents demanded answers, and an independent investigation was commissioned by the school board. That investigation uncovered troubling patterns. Principal Ashton had received complaints about Mrs. Vance's teaching methods from several parents over the years, not because she was abusive, but because she maintained high academic standards and didn't grade inflate. Parents who wanted their children to receive easier A's had pressured Ashton to intervene, and he'd been looking for an excuse to remove her. When the abuse allegations emerged, he'd seen an opportunity to get rid of a teacher he viewed as causing parent relations problems. The investigation also revealed financial irregularities. Principal Ashton had been accepting gifts from wealthy parents in exchange for favorable treatment of their children, not large enough to qualify as bribes under criminal law, but ethically compromising. He'd been steering students into specific teachers' classes based on parent donations to school programs he controlled. He'd been altering disciplinary records for students whose parents contributed to the school's fundraising campaigns. Mrs. Vance had complained about these practices to the district supervisor 2 years earlier, and Ashton had held a grudge ever since. Her complaints hadn't resulted in action against Ashton, but they'd made her a target. When the false abuse allegations emerged, Ashton had immediately sided with the accusers, not because their claims were credible, but because removing Mrs. Vance served his interests. The school board voted to terminate Ashton's employment and referred his conduct to state education authorities for license review. He was eventually stripped of his administrative license and barred from working in education. Mrs. Vance returned to teaching after the criminal charges were dismissed, but not to Meadowbrook Elementary. The environment there had become too toxic. She accepted a position at a different school in the district, one with administration she could trust. The defamation and wrongful termination lawsuits proceeded simultaneously. The 3 accusing families settled the defamation case before trial, each agreeing to pay Mrs. Vance $200,000 and issue public apologies admitting they'd made false accusations. The criminal cases resulted in plea deals where Diane Coulter, Robert Finch, and Angela Torres each pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation and community service. They avoided prison time partly because prosecutors acknowledged that their children had been coached, and the parents claimed they'd convinced themselves the lies were true. The school district settled the wrongful termination lawsuit for $1.2 million and agreed to implement policy changes, including mandatory investigation procedures before teacher terminations, independent review of abuse allegations, and protection of due process rights. Mrs. Vance used the settlement money to establish a legal defense fund for teachers falsely accused of misconduct, recognizing that she'd been fortunate to have evidence proving her innocence, and many teachers wouldn't be as lucky. The community that had participated so eagerly in destroying Mrs. Vance faced a reckoning that was uncomfortable and incomplete. Some parents apologized directly for their role in the harassment. Others remained defensive, claiming they'd been doing what they thought was right to protect children. The most disturbing responses came from parents who seemed to learn nothing, who continued to insist that teachers should be fired immediately when allegations emerged regardless of evidence. The Justice for Meadowbrook students' Facebook group was deleted, but not before screenshots of the most vicious comments were archived and shared, creating permanent records of who'd said what about Mrs. Vance. Several parents who'd been particularly aggressive in calling for her destruction found themselves facing social consequences when the truth emerged. Some lost friendships. Some faced professional repercussions when employers learned about their participation in online harassment campaigns. The mob justice that had been directed at Mrs. Vance turned partially on itself, creating new victims and new grievances. I tried to find some meaning in what we'd all been through. My family's social standing in the community never fully recovered. Rachel and I were invited to fewer gatherings and treated with residual suspicion by parents who resented that we'd questioned the narrative. Connor struggled with bullying for months before things settled into an uncomfortable normal. But we'd done the right thing, and I tried to hold on to that knowledge when the cost felt too high. Mrs. Vance sent me a handwritten note months after returning to teaching. She thanked me for being willing to listen and help when everyone else had abandoned her. She said that having even one parent believe in her innocence had made the nightmare bearable. She'd been on the verge of suicide when Patricia Odom called to say we'd provided statements supporting her defense. Knowing someone cared about the truth had given her reason to keep fighting. I visited her at her new school one afternoon and watched her teach a lesson about the scientific method to a group of engaged 6th graders. She was the same passionate, demanding teacher she'd always been. Her students were learning and growing under her instruction. The false accusations hadn't destroyed her ability to teach, though they'd permanently scarred her trust in parents and administrators. She told me she required everything to be documented now, kept detailed records of every parent communication, every student interaction, every disciplinary decision. She'd learned that competence and dedication weren't protection against malice, that she could do everything right and still be destroyed if someone decided to weaponize the protection systems meant for children. That knowledge had made her more cautious, more defensive, less willing to take risks or form close bonds with students. The accusations had changed her in ways that were tragic even though she'd been vindicated. The children who'd been coached to lie faced their own consequences. Emma Coulter, Mason Finch, and Liam Torres were all required to attend counseling to address the damage done by forcing them to maintain false stories and participate in destroying someone's reputation. The psychological impact of being used as weapons by their parents wouldn't be fully understood for years. They'd learned that adults could be corrupt, that truth was negotiable, that the systems meant to protect them could be manipulated for petty revenge. 5 years after the accusations, I ran into Mrs. Vance at a community event. She looked healthier than when I'd last seen her. Some of the stress lines had softened, though her eyes still carried wariness that hadn't been there before the false allegations. We talked briefly about how Connor was doing in high school, about her continued work with the Legal Defense Fund, about the policy changes that had resulted from her case. She said she'd received letters from 3 other teachers who'd been falsely accused in other districts and had used the security footage strategy to prove their innocence. The precedent from her case had made it easier for defenders to obtain evidence that might exonerate wrongly accused educators. That knowledge gave her some sense that the nightmare had produced something positive beyond her personal vindication. She asked if I ever regretted getting involved. if the social cost to my family had been worth it. I told her that teaching my son the importance of seeking truth over accepting comfortable lies was worth any cost. That watching him grow into a young man who questioned narratives and didn't join mobs was the best outcome I could have hoped for. Mrs. Vance smiled and said Connor had been one of her favorite students that year, before everything fell apart, that his willingness to tell the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent had shown character most adults lacked. We parted ways, and I thought about the 3 parents who'd destroyed her and nearly succeeded in sending her to prison. Diane Coulter had divorced and moved out of state, her reputation too damaged to rebuild locally. Robert Finch had lost his job after his employer learned about his role in the conspiracy. Angela Torres still lived in town, but was socially isolated, regarded with suspicion by parents who'd once been her friends. They'd paid prices for their actions, though whether those prices were adequate was debatable. Their children would carry the weight of what had been done in their names for the rest of their lives. The case became required study in education law courses and was cited in policy debates about due process for teachers accused of misconduct. Mrs. Vance's experience demonstrated how quickly a reputation could be destroyed by lies, how difficult it was to prove innocence, and how critical evidence like security footage could be in preventing wrongful convictions. The broader lessons about mob mentality and the rush to judgment seemed to be absorbed less completely. People preferred to think they'd have acted differently, that they wouldn't have participated in destroying someone without evidence, but I'd watched an entire community do exactly that and knew how easy it was to get swept up in righteous anger that turned out to be directed at the wrong target. Years later, Meadowbrook Elementary installed additional security cameras and implemented strict policies requiring investigation before disciplinary action against staff. The school board created an independent review committee to evaluate abuse allegations before terminations. These changes came too late for Mrs. Vance's first nightmare, but might prevent future teachers from experiencing the same injustice. Progress built on the ruins of destroyed lives was still progress, even if it felt inadequate. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.